Meiji government came to power with the purpose of keeping Japan culturally closed. However, it was necessary for them to adopt Western tactics to defeat the samurai in the Satsuma Rebellion, thus corrupting their purpose.
So in order to be able to understand the revolution that took place in Japan in the middle of the 19th century, it's important to go back some hundreds of years and understand how this so-called samurai government came into power.
The samurai warrior class had been around since the 9th century, but the Japanese islands had been ruled by several petty warlords. The emperor had religious but no political power. It was not until the early 1600s that an actual unified Japan emerged.
In the 16th century, roughly from about 1550 or 1560, there were many different powerful warlords in Japan competing for power. In Japan we know today, as a unified country, didn't exist then. So for a period of 50 years or more, these warlords battled it out. And finally, in the big battle that took place in 1603, the Battle of Sekigahara, the forces of the Tokugawa clan, Tokugawa Ieyasu and all of his forces combined and beat everybody else. So that was the beginning of the Tokugawa period.
The Tokugawa shogunate was a government that ruled a unified Japan. It was led by a shogun in the Tokugawa family. Underneath the shogun, there were provincial leaders called daimyo who ruled over Japan's provinces. It was also under the Tokugawa shogunate that Western influence in Japan was cast out for several centuries.
You had this interaction going on with the West, the Dutch, the Portuguese, and the Spanish. Their spies told them that these countries were making colonies out of countries to the south, like the Philippines and South China. And Japan didn't want to be a colony.
The Tokugawa shogunate lasted for another 250 years, with little or no contact with the West.
However, in the early 19th century, the West began to take interest in Japan again. The West pushed for Japan to be opened up as a supply station for ships on the way to China.
The United States was one of several Western powers that was very interested in using Japan not as a place to conquer, but negotiating treaties with Japan so it could be a fueling point for their ships on the way to the mainland of Asia.
U.S. President Millard Fillmore sent Commodore Matthew Perry to Japan to open Japan's borders to American trade. The Japanese saw Commodore Perry's black ships and would not let him ashore. However, Commodore Perry insisted on seeing the emperor because he did not understand that the shogun had the political power. The Japanese were eventually forced to let him ashore because of his demonstrations of superior firepower. Commodore Perry was introduced to the shogun instead of the emperor, and worked out a treaty that would allow American merchants to trade with Japan. This event marked the beginning of modern influence in Japan.
Many of the Japanese people were unhappy with the changes that the Westerners brought, and wanted to take down the shogun, who they felt was responsible. The shogun then resigned to avoid being assassinated by angry peasants, and the emperor took power. The Japanese then westernized much of their culture and their army. And this is where the conflict began.
Some of the Japanese, like the samurai, did not want westernization and wanted things to go back to the way they were.
One of these samurai, named Saigo Takamori, had been working with the Meiji government.
He wanted to go to war with Korea, but the new government was too peaceful. This did not satisfy his samurai spirit, so he planned a rebellion.
He made secret schools to train new samurai to fight against the Meiji government. The Japanese government discovered his plans and feared a rebellion. They drafted peasants to form a Western-style conscript army fitted with Western weapons. The new Imperial Japanese Army went to put down the rebellion, but was forced to take refuge in Kumamoto Castle. Besieged in Kumamoto Castle for 2 long winter months, the conscript army managed against all odds to survive until reinforcements arrived, when the rebel army had to retreat.
After their retreat, the samurai knew that their time was up. Their leader, Saigo Takamori, decided that in the true samurai way, they would face the conscript army head-on and die doing it. They charged through the first line of infantry, with cannons firing upon them the whole way. As they charged at the cannons, the conscripts took out several Gatling guns and fired at the charging samurai. The samurai charge had failed, and the survivors, failing to reach the guns because of their wounds, committed seppuku, a samurai ritual suicide.
This ended the samurai era and was the final steps of Japan's transition into the modern era. When Japan entered the modern age, it started taking Western technology that it received and improved on it. By doing this, it became the most technologically advanced country in the world, a title it still holds today. To do this, however, the Japanese had to give up much of their culture. One example of this was the westernization of the Japanese army to defeat Takamori's rebellion.
But the point is that this was a moment of tremendous crisis, and the samurai system, the feudal system, had served Japan very well for hundreds of years, but it simply was unable to cope with the changes that had occurred in the world around Japan.
The Satsuma Rebellion, as well as the modernization and westernization of Japan, has contributed not only to Japan today, but also to today's world culture. An example of this is The Last Samurai, a Hollywood version of Japan's transition into the modern world.
Other examples of this are the many 20th century samurai films, such as Seven Samurai. Nevertheless, the Satsuma Rebellion and the fall of the samurai are perfect examples of conflict and compromise in history. They demonstrate the omnipresent conflict between tradition and advance, and show how decisive the choice of one over the other can be on a nation's history.